to imagination universe.
At the time, it wasn't much of a big deal to me, but today, I often think of how lucky I am to still be here. Well, I try to feel lucky, but I also struggle with depression, so there's that. I don't remember quite how old I was. I think it was around 4th or 5th grade because my brother wasn't at home anymore at that time. He was taken away for child molestation of myself when I was in the 3rd grade. I was at a friend's house a few streets away, playing some stupid game where we were whacking balloons with tennis rackets. I got my finger smashed in a racket, by the way. Ouch. Her home phone began to ring. We ignored the first call, but my friend decided to answer on the second ring and set the handset on speaker, despite neither of us recognizing the number. I remember the voice on the other end of the line sounding kinda weird, but as I didn't really have anything to worry about, I ignored the thought. It was a woman named Joanne who worked at the same hospital my mom works at, which was about an hour away. She was asking for my friend's mother, who was not home at that moment, and so my friend and I talked to her instead. Because she worked at the same hospital as my mom, I told her my mom's name and phone number and my phone number for some reason. I don't remember if she asked for it or not, but she probably did. After a few minutes of chatting with the lady about our medical records and grades from school, which should have been a red flag, she asked to speak privately with my friend somewhere closed off, such as the bathroom. So she took the phone with her to her parents' bathroom and was gone for a while. When she did finally come back, she handed the phone to me with a very crinkled nose and whispered, "Be careful," to me. I didn't realize what she meant until later. The woman, Joanne, called my cell phone every day after school. Sometimes she would call while I was at school, and I'd tell her to call later. That was fine with me. It was somebody to talk to. I was frequently bullied, so it was hard to get positive attention from people. I was pretty desperate and easy to manipulate. Honestly, I still am. These calls started off pretty okay, just asking questions about my life and how I was doing that day, which I ate up. I loved that somebody cared enough to ask. But the calls progressively escalated from just questions about my general life to questions about my body and giving out weird orders and making weird exchanges. Orders like what, you may ask? Orders such as touching myself inappropriately and optioning up objects and vegetables to insert into myself near the microphone for her to hear. I actually never put anything inside of myself and faked the noises with my mouth, and she never seemed to notice. Now, exchanges. She had somehow managed to coax me into giving her my home address, so she would stop by and leave paper bags of things for me in the bushes next to my house. These things, such as candy, kind notes, and small dollar store toys, were in exchange for things of mine, clothing, my underwear, my used, unwashed underwear. I did think it was weird that she wanted it, but I was a people pleaser. I still am, and decided not to ask about it. So I would leave my undergarments in a paper bag in the bushes, and there would be candy or cheap toys in there the next day. What a bargain. One day, I was playing in the driveway of another friend's house just down the street when a black car with dark tinted windows drove very slowly by. I turned and looked at the driver's window to see nothing but a dark purple color. I just stared as they drove by. Unfortunately, this car also happened to run over my friend's cat. It spooked me a little, and I went home soon after for a break from playing. Joanne later told me that she saw me playing with a boy down the road from my house. I then knew whose car it was and took the event more lightly. That same day, we had planned to meet up at the park behind my elementary school. It was within walking distance of my house, about 10-15 minutes. It took a lot of convincing, but I finally agreed to go. I made the decision to go right after visiting that guy friend again to make sure he was okay after the sudden and very visible death of his cat. He was mostly all right, but was still pretty sad. I understood that he'd probably want time alone to grieve, so I left again. I paused in his driveway for about 2 minutes, just staring down the road in the direction of the school. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was afraid to be scolded for not showing up, but it was getting dark and something inside of me was screaming at me not to go. I slowly and nervously walked farther from home and all the way to the park behind my school. I looked around for the black car with tinted windows and found nothing, so I went back home. On the way home, Joanne called me and said that she didn't see me anywhere and left after waiting for a few minutes. I explained that I was just there and had left, so we must have just missed each other. She tried to get me to go back, but I was right around the corner from my house and it was only getting darker outside, so I refused and decided that we could plan to meet another day. She agreed. As time passed, my mom was getting suspicious of the calls. She noticed that I was getting called by an unknown caller with a blocked-out number. She'd help me bathe sometimes, and I'd get a call and deny knowing who it is. Sometimes I left my phone at home, and Joanne would hang up when my mom answered. The one time my mom answered using a kitty voice, she got a hello as a response and demanded to know who's calling before Joanne hung up. I know this because my mom told me about it later on. I still denied all knowledge. I came home from school one day and was trying to find my homework that I'd already finished, but it just wasn't anywhere. I asked my mom for help, and she started rummaging through my backpack to find my papers. Whilst hunting for my work, she came across a folded sheet of paper covered in writing, an adult's handwriting. She called me into her bedroom and asked me about the note because it clearly wasn't by a child. I hesitated and was about to tell her that it was from a teacher when she interrupted me and asked me who Joanne is, as that was the name signed at the bottom. I felt like crying. I was cornered and in distress. I broke. I remember that I was speaking incredibly quickly in my panic, but all I remember saying is, there's this lady who's been calling me every day, and she said she works at your hospital, and she gives me stuff sometimes in the bushes, and we talk a lot about my life, but sometimes she has me do weird stuff to myself, but she told me to keep it all a secret. My mom's eyes widened as she called for my dad and told him to call the police. I don't have much memory of anything of the incident from there, but I do remember that my mom had me get hair extensions to disguise me a little. I also remember sitting in the living room with Joanne on the phone and a police officer standing behind me as I tried to take up an old offer and convince her to get a cell phone so we could talk more often so that she would have a visible phone number. The officer forgot that his radio was on, so the sound of somebody talking into it went off while I was talking. Joanne noticed, and I quickly said that I was watching Cops, but I don't think she believed me. After that failed attempt, I hung up the phone and was immediately told by my mother in a fretful tone. That's a man's voice. I, being the stubborn individual that I was, tried to argue that it wasn't, but I was, of course, incorrect. Joanne stopped calling me after that. But no worries. He was soon caught trying to contact another child in town, and I was sent a copy of his mugshot. He wasn't legally obligated to keep a straight face, so he made the wonkiest expression he could to keep himself from being recognizable. Only made him look more stupid. He had a common name too, although I have forgotten. Well, that's my story of how few minutes of delay saved me from being kidnapped, R-word, and murdered. Even though this happened to me a long time ago when I was still a child, I vividly remember it as if it were yesterday. Reflecting on all my achievements, I can't help but wonder how there was a chance that they might not have happened at all. I was 8 years old and had a favorite meal, beans and plantain. Not the homemade kind, but one bought from a specific food vendor near our house. I lived with my mom in a single-room apartment owned by my grandmother. We weren't well off, but we managed. On a particular evening, my mom was in a good mood and gave me money to buy my favorite meal. At the time, I didn't realize how much I could eat, so I unknowingly bought a lot. I happily took it home, and it was already dark. My mom lit a candle and placed it on our small cathode ray tube television. I started enjoying my meal, and my mom asked if she could have some. Reluctantly, I shared, but I began to frown when it seemed she was eating too much. I should have let her have her share. Seeing my annoyance, she laughed and returned the food to me, and I happily continued eating. After a while, I started feeling full. The portion was still too big. My eating slowed down, and it became evident to my mom that I was tired of eating. This made her angry. I was upset with her for eating from my meal, so I had to finish everything. Wasting food was strictly forbidden in our house. There are kids with nothing to eat right now, she would say, implying that I should be grateful and not waste what we had. She ordered me to stand up and finish the food. I wasn't allowed to sit or sleep until I had cleared my plate. So, for what felt like an eternity, I stood up and reluctantly ate the remaining food, my love for it now gone. While I struggled to finish the meal, my mom fell asleep. I stood there, eating slowly until I finally emptied the plate. Finally, with the food still in my mouth, I placed the empty plate with the dirty dishes and took a deep breath. I chewed until I finally swallowed the last bite, then climbed into bed and fell asleep. It was the middle of the night. I woke up feeling sweaty, only slightly conscious. Everything around me was bright orange, hot, and filled with thick smoke. I wasn't alarmed. I didn't even realize it was real. I thought it was a dream, similar to the one where you go to the toilet and pee, only to find out that you actually wet the bed. Suddenly, someone ran through the fiery glow and grabbed me, rushing me outside. That was when I truly woke up. The neighbors had gathered. The entire room was engulfed in flames. The man gently placed me on my feet next to my mom and grandma as they all tried to extinguish the fire with buckets of water. I didn't know what had happened while I was asleep, and I wasn't blamed for anything either. However, I finally understood that I hadn't extinguished the candle before falling asleep. I had believed that the candle would naturally burn out once the wax was finished, which was true. But the candle was directly placed on a plastic cathode ray tube television, and it caught fire upon direct contact. The entire room was consumed by flames, and we lost nearly everything of value. And there I was, surrounded by fire, sleeping peacefully. That could have been the end for me. With the help of our neighbors, the fire was eventually extinguished, and we eventually moved on from the losses. Now, it's just a story of how I narrowly escaped death. It was a magical time, the summer of 2005. I was 18 and had just finished high school a month earlier. I had been accepted into the program I desired at my university of choice and was going to be picking my classes in about a week. I had an awesome job, an absolutely amazing girlfriend, and then best of all, my affordable dream car, a heavily modified 1991 Nissan 240S. Her name was Bessie, and it was just awesome. Unfortunately for me at the time, I had a bit of an attitude problem. I was convinced, absolutely convinced, that nothing bad could ever actually happen to me. I was in control of everything around me, and sure, bad things could happen to some other guy, but never to me. I guess it's fairly common growing up. That feeling of invincibility. It was a very wet, rainy summer, and the night of Monday, July 26th, at about 11:30 p.m. was no different. I had just left a friend's place and was driving home. I'd like to stress, at this point, that I was 100 sober, verified by both witness accounts and blood tests. I was under no influence other than my own stupidity and recklessness when I made these decisions. I was doing approximately double the posted speed limit, 120 kilometers per hour in a 60 kilometers per hour zone, down a rather empty, due to weather and time of night, main road near my house, which was just about 2 minutes away. It was at this point that I hydroplaned and struck the left-hand side curb. Bouncing off of that, I spun across the street and jumped the right-hand side curb, leaving the paved surface of the road and sliding across the grass that ran adjacent. At this point, I had spun about 130 or so degrees clockwise while still sliding in a forward direction, and it was then that I struck a light post. The aforementioned orientation of my vehicle meant that the point of impact was right on the rear end of my driver's door, about 4 to 6 inches behind my seat. I was traveling 93 kilometers per hour at the time of impact, and the light post penetrated about 2 feet into the vehicle, completely obliterating the driver's section where I happened to be. I was wearing a seatbelt, but the impact moved my seat forward and to the right, obviously. This left me in quite an awkward position. I had shattered my pelvis and left femur, fractured my right femur, and fractured every single rib on my left side. All but about 4 ribs on my right side were also fractured. I had a hairline spinal fracture in my lumbar region. I forgot which vertebrae, and fractured left humerus. Both lungs suffered multiple punctures and my thoracic diaphragm collapsed. Additionally, my kidneys were partially crushed and my bladder was severely lacerated. I also had several internal lacerations and was internally bleeding quite severely. I tore my mitral valve, leaving it with a murmur, and I sustained several significant peripheral nerve injuries, most notably to my L5 spinal nerve. That being said, somehow, remarkably, I avoided any sort of head injury or spinal cord injury. EMS arrived in a few minutes and jaws of lifted me from the vehicle. In the hour or so it took for them to extract me from the vehicle, as well as load me into a helicopter for an airlift to the hospital, which was only a few minutes away. I had lost consciousness and the ability to breathe on my own. 8 pints of blood were also lost during this first hour. Upon landing at the hospital, I did regain consciousness, and after the first round of emergency surgery, I was put into a drug-induced coma. The internal bleeding was too severe to be stopped all at once. I bled out continually for about 4 days and spent most of that time on a pretty much constant transfusion. I had several chest tubes inserted to deal with the lost blood, but still had several hematomas. I was also on full life support for about 8 days. Just about everything, with the exception of my kidneys, failed. In just about every sense, my body was trying to die at this point. I remained in the coma for 3 weeks, undergoing several reconstructive surgeries to rebuild the bones I had shattered. I was initially unresponsive to external stimuli for a few days, but I slowly began to come out of the coma. I started to fight and attempt to pull at IV lines and the breathing tube, so I was then tied to the ICU bed. Really not a fun way to wake up. I was under full spinal precautions, including an awful neck brace, and the peripheral nervous system injuries meant that I couldn't move or feel my legs. For all I knew, they were no longer there. Being tied to the bed and unable to communicate verbally because of the breathing tube didn't make the experience a pleasant one. Fluid began to collect in my lungs, and I developed pneumonia, something which I didn't have the strength to fight off. A tracheotomy was performed as the breathing tube was facilitating the development of the inflammation. Somehow, soon after that, I got a blood clot in my right knee. A small filter was inserted in a vein downstream of the clot, and I began a heparin regimen. The filter was removed about 2.5 months later through a vein in my neck via a long wire with a hook on the end. Although local anesthetic was used on my neck, I was awake and fully conscious and aware for that entire surgery. It was awful. I also contracted a weak methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus infection while I was on the trauma unit. Several of my surgical sites became badly inflamed and infected, and additional surgeries had to be carried out to clean everything up. I spent 3 months in ICU, and afterwards, I was sent to an auxiliary rehab unit where I had to learn how to walk again. I had very limited muscular control over my lower body. However, no nerve pathways were severed, and over time, I began to regain both sensation and muscular control. I lost over 75 pounds during this time, and at the worst point, weighed about 80 pounds. I'm 6 foot 3 inches tall. I literally looked like someone you saw in the old Holocaust films that you saw in high school. I literally had nothing left on my body. I spent an additional 2 months in rehab, and I was discharged from the hospital the week of Christmas, 2005, 5 months after my original injury. By all accounts, I never, ever should have survived that first night, let alone the entire experience. I've had 12 major surgeries, including the implantation of 5 titanium plates, along with 4 or 5 dozen screws. There's quite a bit of wire still in my chest that was used to hold a few ribs and my sternum together while they fused. At one point, about 2 months in, a section of this wire right in the middle of my chest came loose and over a period of 2 days, bored its way through my chest alien style until it punctured through my skin. That's really not a nice thing to see. Additionally, I now have a mechanical heart valve in place of my original mitral valve. I've had 12 CT scans, 4 MRIs, 3 NM perfusion scans, and probably several thousand x-rays and dozens of minor medical procedures. A little over 550 stitches, sutures, and staples were used through all of this, and I spent 2 years in outpatient physiotherapy. Since this has happened, I've returned to school, and I have completed a mechanical engineering degree, and I am doing quite well. I also volunteered with a program at the hospital I nearly died at, speaking to youth, generally grades 9 to 12, about life, decisions, risks, and my own experiences. Oh, I'd like to say, I was the sole occupant of the vehicle and the only vehicle involved, so thankfully no one else was injured by any of this. I made a poor decision or two, took a risk, and paid quite dearly for it. Do learn from my mistake. Please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. We want to get to 1,000 subscribers before the year runs out. This is Imagination Universe, where stories are told. And we would also love to share your stories. If you have a story you want to share, please check the descriptions for how to send it. Thanks for tuning in. Peace.